All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our episode today of Peak. And today we have Derek Hook, Dr. Derek Hook, joining us. He's an associate professor of psychology at Duquesne University. And we are hoping to have a very deep and meaningful conversation about, as you already know, human transformative experience from Derek's personal and theoretical perspective. Derek, why don't I give you a chance to introduce yourself and tell us what your work is generally about, and maybe um, also share a transformative experience that you've had in your life that you see as formative of who you are and the kind of work that you do and the way you show up in the world.
Sure. Thank you, Gary. Great to be here with you guys. Little bit of background. I'm originally from South Africa. I spent 11 years in London at the London School of Economics and Birkbeck College, and now I'm at Duquesne University. And in those various institutions, I've tried to engage with theoretical psychology, critical psychology, psychoanalysis, and critical theory in many ways. And I suppose the overarching theme that links all of these various facets is the idea that we should have a commitment to thinking broadly, theoretically, philosophically as a way of informing the parameters of the psychological. The last couple of years, that focus has been, well, more than the last couple of years, for the last 10 years or so, I've been particularly attuned to post-colonial theory, critical theories of race, but also Lacanian psychoanalysis. So in some of the examples and thoughts that we'll develop and hopefully discuss, those will be some of the trajectories that are apparent, not the only ones, but they will be of some importance. Regards transformative experiences, suddenly when Gary offered that comment, it feels like there was a whole bunch of them that went through my mind, which is a little bit paradoxical because, you know, sometimes you think, well, what is the transformative or the one or two transformative moments in one's life? So maybe I'll introduce some of those as we go on, but maybe one interesting theme here would be just also to say, you know, I don't know how you guys have gone about thinking this theme of the transformative and transformative experiences. But one idea that appeals to me suddenly is that sometimes it's not necessarily the big things. Maybe there are those as well, you know, the kind of shocking, changing events, often interestingly, presumably linked to an end, maybe to the loss of someone close, difficult transformations, which end up leaving their imprints on you. But I like also the idea that sometimes it can be a seemingly modest thing. And I mean, this may be completely arbitrary, but like, you know, bearing in mind the psychoanalytic backdrop to some of my comments, is it really arbitrary? But one of the thoughts that just emerged in my mind when Gary said that was, I remember arriving in Pittsburgh in January 2015 and seeing something I'd never seen before, which was, I think it was the polar vortex. And it looked like around Duquesne University, and I was staying in this little guest room, there was like blocks of ice on the pavement. And I was like, I've never seen things be this cold that those big blocks of ice are going to still be there tomorrow. And then immediately I thought, if I get locked out of my apartment, I might freeze to death. It's a bit of a silly thought, but at the time it didn't feel so silly. So maybe we can circle back to that or not. And maybe just one further comment then is what's also interesting, just before we open it all up, is sometimes the transformative moments seem to link up interestingly to those idea of those experiences that somehow stand out. And I'd be interested to hear what you guys think and say about that, because sometimes the experiences which stand out, a bit like the famous, often cited Heidegger's example of the hammer, you don't notice it until it breaks, it's not working. Sometimes the things that stand out, and there one would assume by virtue of standing out, have more of a transformatory potential or power. Sometimes the ones that stand out is when something fails or when something doesn't work or when something becomes notable, maybe because it's actually quite unpleasant. So those are just an array of thoughts, but very interested to hear what you guys might have to offer on that.
That was a lot of beautiful imagery that what you said evoked in me, actually. So it sounds like the main thread that I'm hearing is there, and what you're saying is something like transformative experiences aren't always the things that are foregrounded in our experience. They're not the things that are most salient, but sometimes they're all the things that are happening in the background in the subtle and hidden ways that still affect us. And that's where the psychoanalytic sort of sensibility that you obviously have kind of shines through from what I'm hearing. And
I mean, one way, Siraj, maybe you would have some thoughts on this. You know, on the one hand, you could have, and I don't know enough about the general remit of humanist theories and humanistic understandings, Maslow's ideas, so on and so forth. But the kind of psychoanalytic flavor to what I was just saying seems to suggest that the things that stand out are sometimes the things that are kind of minimally traumatic, like something didn't work out, something went wrong, and that's more memorable. Now, you know, we know, for example, in social psychology, you know, you have these effects whereby the prospect of losing $5 is a more powerful emotional effect than negatively than the positive proportionate gain is by happiness by gaining $5, for example. So what is it about the negativity of experience which means that they registered more powerfully? But I suppose what I'm wondering then is, and I'm not necessarily wedded to this or allegiant to this conceptualization, but you could say in a kind of psychoanalytic way, maybe it's events that seem to be a little bit more unpleasant, even potentially traumatic or disruptive or destabilizing, that have a transformative power, and maybe more so than those moments that might lead to some kind of self-actualization. Now, as I say, I'm not trying to necessarily push for that view above all others, but it seems a nice potential tension or debate. So I just wanted to throw that in there and see what you guys think of that.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Derek. One thing that comes to my mind is more from cognitive psychology, which is that we have a negativity bias. We have a tendency sometimes to focus on the negative. As Gary was talking about, the hero's journey almost always, if not always, involves some sort of crisis that the hero in the making has to face and to vanquish and overcome to return to the state of the normal or perhaps the paradise afterward. So there is definitely that negative side. I've thought about this in terms of psychoanalysis and humanistic theory. In psychoanalysis, of course, since Freud, there is the focus on trauma, which I think is important. And there isn't really a kind of contrast concept in humanist theory. If there is one that exists, I would say it's Maslow's peak experience. But the way that Maslow describes the peak experience is that it can be rather chaotic. It's not this neat thing necessarily. Maslow experienced some himself, and when he's writing, it's almost like he's some sort of creative mad genius, which, you know, sometimes people associate with neuroticism or with they don't romanticize it necessarily in the way that some others do. So there's a bit of a perspectival aspect that comes along with that.
Yeah. I mean, just one thought that just briefly comes to mind is maybe we nuance things here a little bit or find some common ground of sorts, is that maybe, not always, and I do want to circle back to the idea of modest transformatory moments, which I can say something about. But if we were to divide up a series of conceptualizations of what is transformative for people, one of those possible areas would be intensities of experience. And I think it might be useful there to talk about intensities of experience rather than simply negativity or trauma, because sure, unfortunately, those things can be transformative and can have a very powerful role. Yeah, suddenly I'm flooded with more examples, but those things can certainly have a role. But presumably, things that might be also positive can still also exert a very powerful role. Peak experiences But what would those things have in common would be something like the intensity of an experience. But just maybe just to finish off one of those thoughts, I've always wondered why in psychoanalysis there's this utilization and affinity for tragedy. Now, in some Lacanian circles now, people are saying, well, comedy is actually the genre that's more instructive at some level of human experience for whatever reason. But this somewhat grim idea that it's in the great tragedies that we find something essential about human subjectivity. Yeah, I suppose I see some of that. And I suppose just to highlight, like sometimes it's, if you think about people who've lost something, or who have suffered, in the history of existentialism, I suppose you could say also that unfortunately, and I'm thinking of Frankl, this idea that like it is through suffering where one attains a degree of truth or a different, a fundamentally changed vision and perspective on the world is not something we should forget. And, I kind of immediately feel like, well, I don't really feel like exploring lots of my own suffering experiences. But just to make that point is that you could say, almost as a methodological point, if there is some truth in that it's sometimes our failures that are most galvanizing, sometimes the losses, the heartbreaks, the bereavements that might impress upon us or change us. It may also be the case that in doing research on this topic, people may want to veer away from those topics simply by virtue of the fact that they're not that pleasant to talk about sometimes. So just to make that note.
So that's really beautiful, and I want to share some of the connections that everything you guys just said made for me. So this is tied to psychoanalytic thought and maybe even to Buddhist thought and to cognitive science and phenomenology, actually. So it's a very holistic way of looking at it. Maybe one way of thinking about why suffering has been seen as playing a central role in the cultivation of self-awareness for example, the psychoanalysts. A good way to think about that, I think, might be to think about what suffering is to begin with, which is obviously a difficult thing to think about. But one way we can do that is by contrasting, right? Like a lot of people tend to think that suffering means pain, but that's an equivocation. Suffering isn't pain. Suffering is to pain as madness is to anger, I would say. Something that a professor of mine once said, it really stuck with me. And this is the reason for that. You can get angry, right, to the point of going mad. So the two, there's a kind of continuity there, but they're not the same thing. In the same way, you can be in pain without suffering, but you can be in so much pain to the point where it actually turns into legitimate suffering. And suffering etymologically, like its root sort of meaning has to do with enduring, right? You suffer when you're forced to endure the circumstances at hand. So suffering is inextricably tied with the loss of a sense of agency. And so you can think about the role of the function of psychoanalysis as being aimed at cultivating a greater sense of agency, right? At heightening one's sense of agency through cultivating self-awareness by way of one's suffering. Because, and this is where the phenomenology sort of comes in, and the Heideggerian example of when you're using a hammer, you're not thinking about using the hammer, you're doing it, right? And the hammer becomes, in a sense, a part of your body. You embody it when it's in your hands and everything is going well. But once there's a sort of breakdown, if you miss the nail, for example, that grips your attention and that pulls you, right, into trying to, you become reflective in that moment of what it is that's happening, and time sort of slows down, and your thinking and your conscious awareness becomes more deliberate, so that you can reorient yourself consciously in order to regain that that grip with the world. And then it becomes unconscious and automatic and implicit again. So sort of tying all this together, when we encounter these kinds of breakdowns at existentially fundamental levels, let's say in our relationships with others, or in our relationship to our own self, or to our future, or to life more generally, or maybe even to death, that shows up in the form of suffering, a loss of a sense of agency. And things like psychoanalytic thought are meant to help to regain some sense of agency in spite of that suffering and in light of it, by bringing it into light, by switching our attention and focus from that automatic, implicit, non-deliberative way of being oriented towards the world to a more reflective one, by way of which we can notice what we weren't noticing that we needed to be noticing in order to regain that fit and to go back into that optimal sort of fit, that grip on the world. And the process essentially circulates, right? It's an endless circle. You keep shifting back and forth from the hammer is a part of my body, and I'm not really thinking about how things are going, and then I experience some sort of breakdown, which pulls me into that reflective space, that reflective mood and mindset. And then once I learn what I need to learn, I go back in, and that of course can happen at various varying degrees of intensity. Going back to another point that you were making, and maybe even in a lot of different valences as well. These kinds of experiences, breakdowns, can be triggered by both positive, so to speak, and negative events. So.
Yeah, I mean, if it's okay, maybe I'll just pick up one of the strands there. I mean, that was a very articulate weaving together of a whole series of thoughts, Gary. So thank you for that. Just one brief thought is, you know, sometimes you go into like a podcast interview and you got all your theory in line. And of course, now I feel like in the back of my head, I've got all these examples which are like knocking on the door. I suppose one of the things that came to mind was that, and I've already mentioned it, that sometimes it's failures where one ends up exerting a transformative influence. And maybe just to nuance or pick up on one of Gary's thoughts about suffering and the lack of agency, I kind of wondered whether there might be moments when we could turn that on its head so that suffering does give way to a kind of agency. That sounds odd, right? Because you could say part of what suffering is precisely not to be agentic enough in one's experience because one's on the receiving end of suffering. And maybe suffering's not quite the right word here, but I was thinking two things, one theoretical and one more personal about a psychoanalytic experience. Just to share with you then briefly, which may be a more general psychoanalytic experience about being in a psychoanalytic treatment. I would say that maybe one of the things that in retrospect about my involvement with psychoanalysis and being in an analysis for like 7 years was this, a realization that implicitly what I really would have liked is to have been given the award that said, you're the good boy, you're the clever guy, you're the nice young Lacanian who's brilliant and all this stuff. You know, it's not like something I would have said as such, but presumably like it was kind of what I desired. To put it even more straightforward terms, what I would have loved is if my analyst would have been able to reflect some of those things or say those things or enact that idealized vision that I had had of myself. And maybe at some level, we all want something of that to be loved in a certain way. But I suppose I would say that maybe perhaps the central thing that I found at least potentially transformative about that potential was that it ended up in a bit of a broken heart in as much as my analyst was never going to sustain any of those images of mine, those fantasy images. So in a way, it was a kind of being brought down to earth. It was a kind of dissipation of, you know, whatever you want to call it, narcissistic fantasies of my own, capacity or my own greatness or intelligence. And in a way, yeah, that kind of was difficult to deal with. That was a kind of failure. That was a kind of series of self-images being deflated. But of course, what also became apparent was that was precisely the point of the analysis in a way. So to give you a different spin on that, you know, sometimes maybe I just have these ideas and fantasies to make me feel better about myself. But you can imagine someone who's at a given, you know, they're in a university career, they're grad students, and some door opens and suddenly they're seen as fantastic, and they're made a professor in 3 years, and they're attain a degree of fame. I mean, it's kind of a Hollywood thing, right? Imagine that, the young actor or whatever who suddenly is much loved and achieves meteoric success overnight, which is presumably the stuff of all of our fantasies in some way. We are recognized for what's intrinsically great about us. So at one level, that sounds wonderful. And it is the thing that we live for, or, surreptitiously perhaps populates our fantasies of what we would like and how to be recognized. But I suppose one kind of psychoanalytic possible lesson of that is what could be worse? Because if you get everything you want and you aim for that and you receive those recognitions, maybe that cuts off a whole series of different perspective routes through life, a whole series of different other possibilities. Maybe that sounds like a little bit of a rationalization as well, but I suppose there is an idea here that maybe, and there's okay, let me just cut to the chase. There's this quote that Jacques Lacan uses in his 11th seminar, and he says something like, there is cause only in something that doesn't work. Or if we paraphrase that again, it's only through a kind of failure that a kind of emergence might happen. And again, we're not taking this as a universal precept or something that we have to live our lives by. But maybe that then suggests that it's only in a kind of derailment or in a kind of failure or in a kind of, I don't know, maybe not suffering, but that you have a different form of agency rather than your glib visions of what you would like to achieve all happening. You really now need to either reconsider or purposefully, in a more enlarged sense of agency, perhaps, get a sense of, well, what do I do with life now? And maybe in an odd sort of way, I've been given a golden opportunity to rather be what I can be or differently be than some slightly facile trajectory, facile idealistic hopes of what I can be. So just to throw that in there, and then maybe just to kind of change tack a little bit, I'm also interested in this idea that there could be the small little things. And I'll give an example of that. For a while, I was interested in the literature about when something changed in therapy, like when was a transformative moment. And in psychoanalytic circles, you sometimes see this, particularly in training situations. People trade their stories. Wow, this happened to me and this didn't. But sometimes it can be quite modest things. And I mean, I don't know whether here's an opportunity to give yet another anecdote, but sometimes it can be in something that one says, a small thing that is heard and kind of hangs in the air by virtue of that situation, that one can be maybe not quite transformed, altered, shifted by virtue of something that one has said. And I don't want to carry on too long because I want to get some feedback and comments and thoughts and input from you guys. But I was quite taken with this idea that maybe it's not so much that I need to change, I want to change, and therefore psychologically I'm pushing towards this change, and then I make myself change, but rather that by using words, using language, expressing myself in a symbolic means, language, words that I never have full control over, that an utterance that I say in front of someone may end up having a changing effect on me. And I kind of like that idea. It's not only a psychoanalytic or Lacanian idea, because we could think about ideas in speech act theory, like to make a declaration, to make a promise is to do something which also then has a kind of effect on what my behavior should subsequently be, right? But I kind of like the idea because if we're in psychology and we think psychologically about change, there is the possibility that we may overlook the fact that it's the symbolic utilization of language, spoken, the communicative utterance, uttered to someone, that when I realize what I've said, so to speak, when it affects me, that's maybe more where the prospect of transformation might be than, as it were, a willful, psychological, egoic attempt to change myself. Anyways, just some thoughts.
That's very interesting. And I feel like there's two different, we're sort of at a crossroads here, at least I am. That's where I'm finding myself. The first thought, I guess, that I had in respect to the first part of what you were talking about is that the circle came back to my mind of, excuse me, it seems like when you were describing your, the fantasy of wanting to hear praise, for example, from your analyst, or have these sorts of fantasies, right, fed into and appeased, right, and how sustained frustration of these fantasies, of these parts of yourself, led to the relinquishing of these fantasies, and therefore the opening up of all the space that they were taking up within your psychic life, which is essentially how I pictured what you were saying. It makes me think how maybe the psychoanalytic process is essentially a kind of like plumbing service, a psychological plumbing service where there's these blockages that exist within yourself, certain fantasies or presuppositions that you may implicitly hold without even having, right, conscious awareness of. And that's exactly what the idea there seems to be, to me at least, such that the way, sometimes maybe the only way you can become aware of them and to remove them, to afford a kind of resilient and adaptive flow of energy within your life, right, within your psychic life, is to get frustrated at the right level, so that when a breakdown happens, which is what you were saying sounded to me like, I keep wanting to be praised, for example. That was the implicit desire there. And the only way you can become aware of the fact that it's an implicit desire that's driving you implicitly, unconsciously, is if it remains frustrated long enough for your attention to right, be pulled towards it. And in that process of self-awareness, right, that consciousness building, that's when you get an opportunity to reorganize your sense of agency and to become more of an agent rather than a puppet.
Yeah. I mean, just one thought that came to mind there is like, I mean, again, being kind of confessing, whatever, disclosing, just to note something about that is you could, anticipating where you might have been going with that discussion, you might say, well, that's where redemption lies. You find this thing, this frustration. But I kind of wondered whether, I'm not sure redemption is quite the right word here, because if I speak about my experiences in analysis, it still kind of hurts a little bit. I mean, it sounds silly to say that, but wow, wouldn't I like to have been fast tracked to be like in the training institution, like the new, like, I don't know, whatever, given some little title, or I would love that. And in other words, I don't think it ever quite goes away, the degree of, I didn't quite end up being able to achieve what I'd like to have been able to achieve. And you're going to love this, Gary, or maybe you won't, I don't know. It suddenly just popped into my mind in Star Trek, okay, like the old Star Trek with Captain Kirk. It's just like hopeless. But anyways, there's an old episode of Captain Kirk where he and Spock or whatever go to another planet, and some guy says, I've invented a machine that takes away trauma and bad memories and pain. And of course, a whole lot of things emerge around this. And at some point, I don't know why I remember this, okay, but like Captain Kirk says, no, I don't want you to do that to me. I want to remember my bad stuff. I want to remember my painful experiences, because if you took them away, I would no longer be me. And of course, now I relate that I make it sound a bit trite and a bit simplistic and silly. And I'm kind of thinking, maybe I'd rather just get rid of those headache, horrible, bad experiences. But on the other hand, I suppose you could say that, I don't know. I don't want to sound romantic or melodramatic or something, but it's kind of like scar tissue's there. Scar tissue's part of it. scar tissue, the remnants, the traces, not even the physical scar, but the psychic traces are a challenge. And, we see a vague reverberation of this even in someone like Erickson talking about the crises of development. He means something particular by that, but like and maybe it's also a bit like, what you've been speaking about in terms of this narrative structure, that, the hero's journey, that there needs to be some crisis. But I suppose my only point of difference then is maybe what makes the crisis able to extend one's agency and to exert an ongoing, resonating, reverberating influence on one's life is not that there is a redemption that is then like achieved and it's okay. I mean, maybe, let's hope, okay, let's hope. But that in a sense, and I think if you was to speak to people who've lost people, particularly children or people close to them, they would say that the pain never fully goes away. It's made more manageable.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's beautiful, and I agree with that. And I should have been more careful with my language. Actually, that's the neurotics whole thing, right? Being more careful with language. But the way I see it, redemption isn't when you get what you desired that was previously frustrated.
Okay.
The redemptive moment is when your relationship with your desire, with your desiring, right, and with anxiety shifts in the direction of something more flexibly adaptive, less rigid.
I'm with you. Yeah. It kind of reminds me, I mean, like, this whole idea of the narrative of the hero's journey. I mean, I know you guys approach it from a certain theoretical perspective. What it reminds me of actually is, if you do one of these, an MA in fine arts, in writing and literature, and you kind of need to engage with this because it's the basic building blocks that make many, presumably almost all stories work, right? But one element there is the kind of idea that, like, you're not going to have an interesting character unless they have some conflicts, unless they have a crisis, and also actually when they have some kind of tragic, fatal flaw or something. And I suppose, Gary, your words make me think that it's useful that you made that qualification, because I think we should hold out a prospect for redemption. But the point that I think you're making is that redemption doesn't finally, fully, absolutely restore paradise as it once was, but it is redemptive in a way where maybe, and of course, we can also differ on this slightly. Maybe one way of thinking redemption is that it does result in a changed world, not necessarily the one that you could go back to, and maybe in some ways one that is less perfect, but somewhat maybe more interesting and more hopeful and more open, possibly by virtue of the fact that it still encloses within it the prospect of some kind of lingering injury, so on and so forth.
So two comments about that, if that's okay. First, yes, to the fact that what redemption does is it doesn't change your perspective. It changes your perspective on your own perspective taking, such that transforms your perspective. That's what I would say, which is why it's like a paradigmatic shift that happens in your right relationship with the world at the pre-reflective level. It's like prior to the age of 4 or 5, when children are still in their egocentric sort of way of relating with the world, they're unable to take the perspectives of others. They assume that their perspective is the perspective, right? Mm-hmm. So the kinds of redemptive, transformative moments that I'm referring to here, and that I think we're talking about, are those of the child who, right, whose understanding transforms and transcends the egocentric way of relating to the world to something beyond. And it's that kind of transformation that's implicated here. Mm-hmm. It's not your perspective that changes per se, but it's a meta perspective that becomes more available, such that then transforms your perspective. So it's not even the way I'm seeing the world, but the way I realize that my standing in relation to the world is directly constituting the way the world actually shows up for me. So I'm not just seeing a world that's there. The way I'm orienting myself to the world is actually making the world appear as it is. So I'm actually taking a part in making the world appear as it is. So there's that sort of agency that's also heightened there. And the second thought that I want to throw there is that, Viktor Frankl was a hero, not because he stopped the Holocaust or ended it or anything, but because his entire situation and his narrative, his journey, right, of self-reflection through the atrocities that he experienced during the Holocaust, they signified a sort of upper limit to how bad suffering can get. And despite how bad suffering can get, that it's still possible to find that redemptive chance to penetrate straight into the core of one's implicit assumptions as to how reality is or ought to be, even when reality is as bad as you could not even imagine, right? And still to be able to transform that and to find some sort of meaning in the suffering. So I think that the hero's journey is not that the hero never gets what he or she wants, but that ultimately what's transformed is their relationship with their desire, their relationship with their anxieties, right? And their relationship to their relationship taking with themselves, the world, others, the future, the past, everything. So, and maybe at this point, it might be appropriate to, I know we've all been curious because you've got a background in Lacan. If any of this you feel like is directly tied to or connected with Lacanian theory, and we could go there if you'd like, if you see it appropriate.
Oh yeah, sure. No, I'd love to do that. There's 2 or 3 different ways we could take up this issue.
And before, if we are going to take it up, then why don't we start? Because I'm sure that not a lot of our listeners are going to know much about Lacan. So maybe in like a few minutes, like a 1 minute sort of intro to the main idea or ideas in Lacan. What sets it apart from, well, what makes it a kind of psychoanalysis and what makes it unique? And what's useful about it, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I can kind of do that. So Jacques Lacan is the French psychoanalyst who starts his career as a psychiatrist and, does a whole lot of psychiatric stuff. And at some point starts drawing a little bit on Freudian theory and then kind of engages it, in a very central, immersive kind of way. And one of the concepts that he wants to really push forward, which will directly inform the example and idea that I'm about to share with you, is that he says psychoanalysis is fundamentally about speech. It's fundamentally about language. So if we're going to really remain faithful to whatever Freud wants to say, it's not about, we need to remain focused on language, words, speech, symbolic interaction. It's not that in the clinic we should be trying to extrapolate and imagine what we feel or what we feel or what we think the other person feels, all of that stuff. We should attend to the concrete stuff of their signifiers, their words. Now, an awful lot more that can be said about that, but one direct line that comes out of that, and just also to note that the way that Lacan went to do that was to say, well, there's this big revolution that's happened in linguistics, structural linguistics, the study of signs, the study of signifiers, so on and so forth. And he wants to import that completely. And for, maybe 10 years within his teaching, it's almost as if he's rereading Freud again, trying to remain faithful to Freud, but through the concepts, the ideas, the theoretical apparatus that structural linguistics gives to him. But having said that, here's one idea, and I've already alluded to it. Lacan wants to keep us focused on the potentialities of speech itself. So one idea to throw out to you guys is in what ways can speech be transformative? And you could say, once Lacan has now hitched his wagon to this idea that psychoanalysis is fundamentally the speaking cure, the speaking treatment, how change can be affected through words, how change can be affected through speech. That's his crucial fundamental commitment. Then we have a little bit of a research task ahead of us. We could say, well, how is it that some forms of speech don't seem to change or have a kind of transformative effect on us, whereas others do? And in this respect, Lacan also borrows from Heidegger. Heidegger's got this famous distinction between a type of idle chatter, idle speech that seems to go nowhere, the kind of self-referencing speech, that I use when I'm trying to create a nice impression in your mind about myself, or when it's just not getting us further to the being of the world, to truths of existence, so on and so forth. And you could say then for both Lacan and Heidegger, before getting overly excited about the fact that language and speech and my own pronouncements might change me, one needs to admit that there's a whole lot of speech that seems to do exactly the opposite. And I was kind of taken for a while by, what's his name now? I forget the guy's name. Anyways, there's a little book by a scholar called On Bullshit. And, he was trying to
Harry
say...
Frankfurt.
There you go. Thank you. Harry Frankfurt. And anyway, so, those are three different theoretical trajectories, but each of them is somehow suggesting that speech can be essentially there to bullshit. Or in more Lacanian terms, it can be there to actually act in a defensive way, that I would be so committed to creating an image of myself that I like of myself, not hearing anything that somehow destabilizes or inconveniences me, that I might spend a great deal of my life using that speech to that end. So the implication of this then is how might speech enable me to shift, to change? And here comes the distinction Lacan makes between full speech and empty speech. Empty speech is essentially, I suppose we could say, is a kind of bullshitting about myself. And full speech is not actually intact pronouncements, but are those gaps, those misconstruals, those unintended implications, maybe even Freudian slips that open up a possibility of something else being heard in what I've said. Now, that would be one kind of direct way that in this theory of full speech, Lacan is trying to tell clinicians, listen for what else might be pronounced or what else might be enunciated in the person's attempt to speak about themselves. And in that sense, you could make a distinction between the ego or ego-supporting defensive type of empty speech that we all engage in, every day. Maybe 90% of all speech presumably is part of that, to come up with some kind of imaginary figure, versus those moments when our speech can affect us. And I'll give an example of that, but just let's keep that idea in play. I mean, if we're going to be therapists in any ways, presumably we need to take seriously the idea that our speech may affect us. So again, to reiterate the point made earlier, it's not just that like, oh, I decide I need to change and now I'm going to try and change and words are kind of secondary or the byproduct of that. Lacan takes seriously the idea that words, in some respects, my words might in a way have a resonance beyond my intention, which comes back at me. One example, I've probably used it, and Gary may be familiar with it. I kind of overuse it actually. But for me, one moment that happened in the process of analysis was me complaining and like, oh God, I'm a white South African. I can't stand being a white South African in London. People are seeing me as this white South African, thereby implying, obviously in their minds, so I am assuming, oh, he's this kind of racist guy or whatever. Now, of course, you could say maybe that wasn't the impression a lot of people were getting anyways. So, why is Derek so preoccupied with being seen as a racist or something, which is kind of embarrassing. Presumably it implies that at some level I am or came from a racist heritage, and hence I've got this preoccupation. So there was lots of to and fro about this idea and, a kind of antagonistic relationship, hating my own image, how people were seeing me and how I thought I was being portrayed to people. And at some point in the work, I remember, after talking about this for months and months, I don't even know how it happened, but I said, well, I don't know what to do, but what am I going to do? I am a white South African. The analyst, being Lacanian, stands up, opens the door, signaling, all this variable session stuff. Lacanians don't always work with a 50 minutes, hour. They work to try to end the session when something important has happened, so that it kind of lingers, so that they kind of underline this pregnant moment, this crucial, and in a way, ending the session in those kind of quite abrupt ways itself is a kind of interpretation. It says to the patient, isn't that interesting? What happened there? rather than offering some kind of interpretation. So he stood up, and I'm not able to fully explain it, but something about saying that, it was kind of like my words, I'm a white South African, were like, dude, that's who you are. That's true. And after that, it just wasn't such a big deal for me. It was just like, that is who I am. I don't have to suffer or tie myself up in knots trying to deny this. In other words, what had become kind of a neurotic preoccupation and concern and an attempt to prove that I'm somehow not a white South African or not a white racist South African assumed a different role, or it just wasn't quite so important anymore. It's just like, dude, I can't actually do much more about that. If people are going to see me like that, that's how they're going to see me. Anyways, cut a long story short, I think in Lacanian theory, you could say that what happened there was something maybe a bit like so-called full speech, where I said something, it could have just been an arbitrary, I'm a white South African, and just carry on complaining. But somehow, and I suppose then the theoretical and clinical question would be what was it about that moment? Was it because the analyst also heard it? Was it because he underlined that I'd said that and stood up, noting its significance to me? But somehow those words had a feedback effect on me. And that was a kind of transformative moment. And I want to mention that both because I was saying sometimes it can be a seemingly modest thing, right? It was just so freeing to have that burden off my shoulders, that neurotic self-preconception, that neurotic preoccupation off of my shoulders. So I mention it both because it seems to be a little modest thing that's kind of powerful, but also because it's a symbolic utterance. It's something that I said that by virtue of it having been said, and a therapist analyst emphasizing it in a way that I could hear my own words as they came back at me, created a shift, created a change. We could think of other examples, but that's a personally significant one to me. And yeah, hopefully that answers at least part of your question, Gary.
That's great. So it arouses two questions in me now. One of them is, what was that moment like for you? That making full circle, I guess, back from the frustrated desire to somehow resist against assuming that identity, and the moment you actually assume that identity more fully, when you didn't just assume it, actually, it sounds more like you sort of embraced it in that moment. It was just like waiting to happen, and then you like fell into it, and there was a shift of some sort. So my first question is, what was that shift like for you in that moment? What did it do to you? And then the second thing, I want to make some comments about everything you said about Lacan and speech in 1 minute. So yeah, I'll wait till you answer the first question though.
Without in any ways being theoretical at this point, it felt freeing. It felt, to resort to cliches, that a weight had been taken off my back. It felt like I'd managed to dispense of a kind of neurotic knot that had started to assume a lot of time and had take up a lot of energy and focus in how I thought of myself and how I portrayed myself to the world. So it felt, it's not like, at the end of the day, it's not like I managed to get out of being a white South African, obviously, because I was affirming it, actually. But it felt like I'd lost a load, it felt freeing. Is the easiest answer, I suppose. And it felt effectively noteworthy. Leaving the room, something had happened. I couldn't quite say exactly how it had happened, but that had happened.
So I think that actually typifies the very thing that we were talking about before, the process of enhancing one's sense of agency through self-reflection, facilitated by frustration, essentially. Because the phenomenology of what you're describing is essentially something like, I feel like more of an agent now. I'm more free. There's a greater degree of freedom now inherent to my position in the world with respect to my own self and to the world. I just love how everything you shared about Harry Frankfurt's On Bullshit ties back into the metaphor of the psychoanalyst as a sort of psychological plumber, right? where
Yeah, that's funny.
To talk about circles, right? Because what empty speech seems to be doing, or what it seems to be analogous to, is our implicit mode of engagement with the world when we're holding that hammer and using it, right? But sooner or later, our patterns of engaging with the world are going to become insufficient. So we're going to experience breakdowns. And what seems to be happening in these moments of empty speech is that if we are put in front of a mirror, which is what the therapy room is kind of like, and what the therapist's presence is kind of like, where you get to speak before a witness, but because the witness is sort of silent and not really saying anything, you become more hyper aware of your own speech. And so it has a mirroring function in a sense. And through that process, you're struck by these moments of insight of where the hammer has gone wrong. But that hammer is the hammer in your speech and your thinking and your feeling and in your way of seeing and taking perspective on the world, on your experience more generally. Such that through that process, you're like doing a lot of psychological plumbing that's facilitated by the therapist, by the analyst in that moment. So
maybe I could just make one, thanks for all of that, Gary, just one further additional qualification to that. And this is something that the Lacanian theory would emphasize. When I'm trying to teach some of these ideas, in undergrad settings, I ask the question of the class, like, who do you confess before? Or what is required for an adequate confession to occur? And, you could say, well, maybe there's multiple levels. Maybe I finally confessed to myself that I actually am gay and I've been hiding this for years. But that doesn't sound like a confession. That's more like a kind of self-reflexive awareness. Or I could confess to a friend, listen, I'm actually gay. Again, it doesn't really sound like a I mean, okay, yeah, it's useful. It's a part of your journey of self-knowledge or something. It's part of coming out, maybe a precondition. But a confession, in a way, seems to require another listening agency or another level of being witnessed. And they're, in Lacanian theory, they're big on that distinction. So to come back to my little vignette, my little self-account, it wasn't just that I was able to say I'm a white South African to some other friend or some colleague. It was somehow amplified and made more functional by being said in a different type of listening environment. And the same holds for a confession, right? You need to make a confession, presumably, I don't know, in the Catholic Church to someone who is significant, who instantiates maybe, I don't know enough about Catholicism, but is somehow official or instantiates God or the church or something. Just as in the same way, if I'm making a criminal confession, it's not good enough just to say to my buddy that, I did this thing. It needs to be somehow spoken in a context that gives it a different listening power, something like that, right? Like, to confess before a court of law is also to confess before history. So, we could spend some time trying to think about that if we want to or not. But I think what's crucial there in the transformative potential of speech is that it's not just within an intersubjective circuit between me and Gary. It's somehow redoubled in its potential power. Let's put it that way. It's redoubled in its power by occurring before some other listening power or listening institution or listening context.
That's what the shift from empty speech to full speech kind of signifies, right? Which seems to be enabled and facilitated by the kind of mirroring and self-mirroring that becomes possible in clinical settings, right? At least in principle, but not only in clinical settings. It could also take place before a good friend or a loved one or even a stranger, possibly. And it's, again, in those moments where you shift into inhabiting a particular mode of self-awareness, self-reflexivity, where you're no longer just paying attention to the world through your thoughts, but you're attending to how you pay attention to the world through your thoughts. And by thoughts, I don't just mean like cognitions. I mean that generally, like feelings, patterns of thinking, feeling, wanting, et cetera, et cetera. Which also raises the question, in a sense, this is maybe the repressed big elephant in the room, right? Where empty speech seems to be the default for most people most of the time. Bullshit seems to be the default for most people most of the time. What's the explanation for that? And I guess to like throw in another question, which one of the boys sent me during the chat, in a private chat actually, which I think elegantly ties into this right now. Who are the heroes in modern day society, and what's the dissemination function that they sort of play in not just disseminating these kinds of insights, these like existential humanistic insights that helped and transform, but they help to facilitate and make possible the heroic mode of being in others through modeling. So there's that intersubjective dissemination question of how to shift the default mode of being from empty speech to full speech on a broader level, and also the question of why empty speech being the default to begin with.
I mean, I can give you a kind of theoretical answer. We don't necessarily have to agree with that, although actually I think I do probably agree with it. The idea, I think, is, at least within Lacanian theory, that the actual base level of fundamental experience of oneself and oneself in the world could be considered to be something quite fragmentary. That what one needs is a kind of glue to hold together the myriad different self-facets experiences that make up the broad ensemble of the stuff that has happened to us, the stuff that we have done. And I kind of like just also, you know, as a kind of experiment in thoughts, playful exercise, asking undergrad students, like, how is that even possible? Doesn't that sound like a little bit of a miracle? If you think about all the various moments in your life, all the horrible things, the nice things, the different parts of you, stuff you wouldn't want to hear about, you wouldn't want other people to know about, as well as the good bits, how in heaven's name do you bring all that together within a kind of sphere of subjectivity, into an identity, into an image, into a self? And the Lacanian argument would be to say that does happen. And the way it happens is by having an image of oneself, an image of who you are that you're involved in, as it were, promulgating every day. And let's also bear in mind, having spoken about bullshit, the idea that I am involved in empty speech attempts to consolidate an image of myself, to consolidate an identity, to give myself more coherence, to present myself in a positive light. You know, we can be somewhat cynical about that and say 90% of all speech is bullshit, but let's also just bear in mind that that's functional. You know, I mean, it's particularly for in the contrast of someone, for example, who is psychotic and doesn't have a sense of self in a way that neurotic people presumably do, that it is functional to be able to have lots of empty speech, to portray a sense of oneself to the world. And we can nicely kind of switch registers here and move from Lacanian psychoanalysis to someone like Irving Goffman, the sociologist, whose ideas of presentation of self are very much about how every day we are involved in what he calls a dramaturgical performance, a presentation, whereby right now, speaking to you guys, I'm trying to, you know, project a certain image. I'm trying to come across as somehow knowledgeable, as likable. And, you know, from that perspective for Goffman, we're all involved in certain kinds of performances. Now, the reason I mention that is because, you know, that's not to say it's all bad. It's not to say that it's all cynical, or it's not to say that I'm fundamentally trying to mislead you, but it is saying that it's through speech, through how you see and apprehend me, that you gain some kind of image of what I am. And so we kind of play that game, right? So just to stress once again, although we can call it bullshit, and although we can call it empty speech, those fundamental attempts to be recognized, to portray myself in some way to you, they may be not perfect. They may bring with them some attempts to make myself look smarter, more intelligent, more capable, you know, presumably. So they're not fundamentally all honest, but they're also quite crucial to buttressing and substantiating a sense of self and an ego. So let's just say they're not perfect, but they're functional. And just to also reiterate that point with reference to the idea that maybe the very base level of experience is something that is fragmentary, that we need images of ourselves and so on and so forth. Sorry, Gary, you're going to have to remind me of the first part of your question, because I just wanted to make sure that even though we're emphasizing that stuff, that's still a condition of possibility for everyday social contact and communication. What was the other part of your question?
The other part, great. So just before I get to that, I just want to reiterate what I heard you say, just to consolidate it. The default starting point of human experience is something like fragmentation and chaos and an undifferentiated sort of field of experience. And maybe we could even take it further than that and say that the basic mode of being is something like anxiety. And until there's structure in place, until I have a sense of order that ties all the different parts of my experience together, then anxiety is what I'm going to be experiencing, right? Which means that what's functional about empty speech is that it leaves a semblance of order in an otherwise, at its base level, disordered or undifferentiated, or maybe those are the wrong terms. Maybe it's something more like an irreducibly complex world or something like that. And you can't ever do away with the complexity. It's always there. So the best you can do is to hide it by projecting some sense of order through your sense of self, which again is always incomplete because it's not exhaustively encompassing of everything that is. So it's always predicated on partial selections of being, right? And it's in the lapses in our sense of self that we find the emergence of the world's inherent complexity that we're kind of compelled or at times forced to deal with, that becomes unavoidable. Which then brings me to my next point. And, the question that I had was, what about the intersubjective dimension? Like, how do we spread insight? How do we facilitate these kinds of heroic moments of shifting from empty speech to full speech? And Socrates came to mind, right? And Socrates, the paradox of Socrates was that that's precisely what he was about. He was there putting people in front of a mirror to show them the lapses, the little gaps in their sense of self and their beliefs and their presuppositions, which for which people would either really love and appreciate him or they would just hate him, right? And the reason why most people would hate someone like Socrates is precisely because in being invited even, or maybe in the case of Socrates, kind of almost like pushed or asserted into a state of self-reflexivity like that, they were forced to confront the incoherencies in their own selves that unleashed all that anxiety that's being hidden and contained and kept at bay by the semblance of order that we all need to have.
That's beautiful. And I mean, I don't know if you know this, but you've kind of dovetailed it perfectly, because, there's these moments where Lacan is of the opinion that so-called no man is wiser than Socrates, so he is aware of some of that stuff and loves this kind of Socratic dialogue as a way of playing with and thinking about some of these ideas. But what you've said is really helpful, and it helps me remember the earlier question. And the earlier question was like, well, why is there such a predominance of empty speech? And, why should we think of full speech as rare, or why should we be so defended against? And I suppose, given what we've now both said, whether you want to put it in more straightforward terms and just talk about kind of psychological blind spots, or whether you just want to say that to have an ego, to have an identity, means that almost by definition, there's some things that are omitted from that. If you're going to put forward and consolidate this kind of palatable, likable image of self, you kind of are obliged to forget about or exclude various facets of the horriblest things you've ever done. Or back to the Lacanian theory that if it is true that the base level of human experience prior to an ego, prior to a consolidating image, which gives me my unification, my sense of self, my sense of self-efficacy, my sense of competence and continuity in the world, if underlying that is something that's far more fragmentary, or to use Gary's expression, is fundamentally a state of anxiety, you could see that we'd be very defensive of and non-receptive to any point of view that would give me a different vantage point on my life. You could say then to have an ego is already to be constitutively defensive toward anything that threatens, that destabilizes that consolidating image, precisely because I need that thing to hold me together, to give me coherence. And so, someone who politely suggests that maybe, Derek, you should clip your nose hairs or something, sorry, stupid example, is not typically met with a big smile on my part, right? I'm being silly, but you could see it's in a way, it gives you a sense also why of the kind of omnipresence of aggressivity in humans when they are told to improve or whatever. I don't want to be too glib now, but you get the point, right?
Yes,
it's like to be an ego is already to be defensively inclined towards anything that would threaten or challenge. Well, there's two sides to it. One, I would lap up and most certainly love anything that would affirm my own narcissism. So if you tell me nice things about myself that help me consolidate this image that holds me together, I'm going to take that stuff and probably, if anything, inclined to be easily seduced by such images. But of course, it's often far more useful to be informed of the moments of inconsistency that I'm not seeing. But of course, I'm going to be pretty disposed to not wanting to hear that stuff. Anyway, so that was just a kind of long perambulation to link back to your earlier question or suggestion, Gary.
No, that's great. And maybe this also ties back into the metaphor of, it certainly ties back into the metaphor of the psychoanalyst as the psychological plumber in a sense. And man, my background is in philosophy. That's what I majored in back in my undergrad. And the reason why I fell into philosophy and fell in love with it was because I read Plato's The Apology, which is about Socrates and the whole no man is wiser than Socrates thing, and being aware of your own, the limitations in your own knowledge and whatnot. But then I soon became disenchanted by philosophy more generally, because what philosophy is about nowadays, academic philosophy, isn't what it was about in ancient Greece, right? And we hear this in the Epicurean maxim, call no man a philosopher who hasn't alleviated the suffering of others. So we could make the case that Socrates was actually kind of like a psychoanalyst, like a kind of portable food truck of psychoanalysis in the polis of Athens, where he would walk around and mirror people's selves to their own selves and try to facilitate that kind of awareness raising that psychoanalysis is predicated upon, which again is aimed at facilitating and enhancing one's sense of agency ultimately.
Yeah.
And
I mean, just to chime in there, I mean, it's, I was kind of battling to try and express why people would be so aggressive or negatively inclined to have their self-images challenged. And I mean, with Socrates, you've got the ultimate expression of like what happens to him in the end of his life for maybe more than one reason. But one of the reasons is that, maybe the city of Athens got tired of him showing up the inconsistencies in the self-narratives that people were presenting themselves through. So it gives a very powerful image of the dangers, in fact, of doing that, and the power of the resistance that people will respond to when being challenged in that kind of way, which is also maybe in some respect a bit of a salutary message for how difficult it can be to be, I suppose, a psychoanalyst or a psychologist, if that's part of what you would aim to do.
So I just got a message from Gil. It's basically making a comment about why suffering therefore acts as the proper entry point for working on one's own self and facilitating self-transformation in that sort of way, as opposed to narcissistic compliments. And this actually makes me think of what at least to me seems to be like an inherent trade-off relationship between feeding into one's narcissism, right, on the one hand, versus challenging it to create space and opportunity for the kind of transformation that we've been talking about today. And I'm thinking, well, what is it like when people do compliment me, when I find myself in the kinds of situations where compliments are the kind of feedback that I do get, essentially? And what that sort of signifies to me is that I'm doing well enough. Like I'm where I should be. I've reached my end state, so to speak, however provisional or tentative that end state is, right? I've nevertheless reached it. So you want to be in places where you feel like that, because that's kind of the environment giving you feedback that you're doing a good job. You're sort of doing what you should be. There's something right about what it is that you are doing. But I guess the threat, the inherent risk there is that that can very quickly turn into a pervasive pattern of self-deception, which is what empty speech essentially is an inaction of, right? Self-deception. So maybe striking that balance. I got your message, by the way, Derek. Maybe it's about striking a balance between feeding into one's narcissism in a way that's wise, while also challenging and doubting and reflexively reflecting and pondering about the incoherencies and the little gaps in one's own sense of self and one's own understanding of the world. And the question is, how do I pit these two against each other to optimize over time, so that I'm neither a full-blown narcissist nor a full-blown skeptic who can't just be. You don't want to be the guy who looks at the hammer but doesn't use it, nor do you want to be the guy who turns everything into a nail. You want to be the guy who can wisely discern between the two and optimize in a real-time fashion. So maybe, since we are nearing the end of our wonderful discussion today, why don't I throw two questions at you? Not as a way of like putting you under the on the spot, but maybe as something to, you know, curiously end off on. One, what can we do in our lives to facilitate this kind of Socratic attitude that's nevertheless grounded and in touch with and compassionate towards our narcissistic selves, right? So that we can find that balance between narcissism on the one hand, but Socratic maybe skepticism on the other, okay? And the other is a more personal question for you. If you could travel back in time and have a conversation with your old self before you had the most meaningful and transformative experiences that you've had in your life, maybe even before times when you have truly suffered, like things have been tough that may have caused you to lose a sense of hope or you know, like low points, right? What would you say to yourself? What would you share with yourself that you now know that would be important for you to have known back then?
Thanks, guys. It's been amazing chatting. And Gary, we always end up, I mean, we should, you know, we don't have time, but I mean, we should do this more frequently because we end up going in so many amazing and interesting directions. The two questions then to respond to them, one of them was like, what could we do in our own lives? And I'm suddenly thought that we'd have to rephrase the question, or at least qualify the question, because I'm not sure it's what we individually can do within our own lives within the remit of our own ego. Because if I give the example that I gave, it was something about being heard in a situation. And I didn't enlarge on that, but you know, the other Lacanian kind of point there would be, I was stressing so many times that my words can have an effect back. It's almost as if it's as if language itself is other. Like it's not just the words as I intended them or as I meant them, but as they hang in the air with a resonance that acts back on me. So in both of those situations, because it needed an other to be there or an other listening situation to be there, it couldn't simply have been a Derek self-dialogue in my own self-monologue within my own head, right? It needed some other, and the Lacanian terminology for that is the le grand autre, the big other, you know, this kind of dimension of history of a broader, like when I was talking about confession, you needed to be in front of a certain institutional representative or something like that. So that needs a dimension of otherness. It's not simply a self-project. It needs to be listened to or heard. It needs that dimension of otherness. And it also needs the dimension of otherness where my words can open up into some other vicissitude, some other expression, some other meaning, some other signification that I had intended them to be. So yes, I suppose we could do something, and we can have and will have changes in our lives But in a way, I suppose I'm kind of pushing back a little bit against how we often think about that within what we could call a culture of psychological individualism. You know, it's not just a self project, it needs some otherness, which, you know, I mean, that's another whole conversation we'll end up having. What is otherness within the subject? And you know, there's lots of Heideggerian implications here, existence, like how I'm existing from outside and so on and so forth. So that would be maybe too theoretical, but just to say that I don't know what it would be for each of us and in what situations. There may be many educational settings, role models, all of that kind of stuff. We'd need to think about a case-by-case basis of people's lives, I think, to try and get that. But maybe it means an openness to otherness, and not in a sense of the platitudes of a kind of humanistic, well, you know, diversity, this, the cultural, no, not just cultural otherness, but an openness to the otherness that is me as well, right? Then the second, what would I go to tell my older self? And I was wondering, Gary, I think I wrote down older self because I think there was a kind of complication in how you put it, to go back in time, but to speak to my older self. I mean, I suppose you mean like being my older self speaking to my younger self. But it also made me think, well, maybe it would work the other way too. But
that was probably a slip on my part. Excuse me.
Well, no, that's okay. I mean, you know, it's fun. You double up on your meaning, right? But here's the paradox then. On the one hand, what one is constantly has one drummed into one when one is doing this kind of psychoanalytic training, certainly a Lacanian psychoanalytic training, is that the analyst isn't the person's buddy. It's not their job to be like give an affirming comment or a recognition, because exactly as in my case that I was so thirsty and desperate for that. I would have loved that, but it wouldn't have piqued my own desire to be something different. It would have just mean, oh, now I affirm my image because I'm seen in a way that I want to be seen by another. So the whole efficacy of the analyst and the analytic treatment was that he systematically avoided affirming me, of saying, you're the good boy, the clever one. He avoided, fundamentally avoided affirming my narcissism, on the basis, or on the presumed basis, that would be far more transformatory than me being recognized and affirmed at some level. So that's a useful principle for a treatment. But on the other hand, one should also think about who's coming to the treatment. And Gary will know this because we were both participant in a seminar where we had a colleague who spoke about working with small children who've undergone all sorts of kinds of abuse, horrendous abuse. And on the one hand, I think it sometimes can be easy to get into this Lacanian mindset of, well, you're not their friend. You're not the person who affirms them. You're their analyst. And that's far more analytically, clinically effective. Yeah, I get that. But bear in mind, I think also that maybe there's the little kid who arrives in your office, who's been subject to all sorts of different types of abuse, what has never really been conveyed to them is, you matter. You are an incredible little human being, and what you think and your experience is valid. So what I'm saying is that it depends on who's walking into the clinic and how you're working. But to go back to the thing about a kind of affirmation or recognition, I just had a moment that came to mind when you were asking the question. I think it's okay to share this, but I remember a colleague talking about a situation when they were doing clinical work, and the person they were doing clinical work with was having a difficult challenge. And in the way they spoke about it, they said, oh, I just thought in that moment, if only when I had spoken to my father the day before, my father had said, you can do this. If they'd said that, I would have been able to prevail. And so what I mean by that is, I think there are moments, I forget exactly how Gary put it, but if particularly we're dealing with a life where that form of ego affirmation hasn't really been present, or has been fundamentally denied, or is not believed, maybe it's not exactly the therapist's job to do that, but to be able to find that moment where one is able to have the resonant belief that I exist, that I matter, that I am a human being, that a self can be affirmed in that way, is enormously important and in some sense essential to a meaningful human existence.
That was beautifully put, Derek. Thank you so much. This has been a very, very transformative experience for myself, and I'm sure for our friends too, Gil and Suraj, and hopefully for our listeners. And essentially, what I heard is a sort of paradox at the very end, which is that on the one hand, you sort of want to try out, and pursue opportunities where you frustrate your desire just long enough, instead of just like blindly and reactively acting on what you want, just to find moments of frustration so that you can then become aware of not what you're craving, but what you might be needing instead. While on the other hand, finding people and sources of encouragement in your life, right? That can affirm your being as it is, to then encourage you to then engage in an exploratory way with respect to your own self and your own understanding of the world. That's also necessary. So now we have two necessary conditions in place. I don't know whether together they're jointly sufficient for transformation, but you need security to keep yourself intact, to then afford the kind of exploration that we've been talking about that leads to transformation, meaningful transformation, and maybe redemption in the sense that we've been talking about it. So before I stop recording, I just want to let our viewers know that Derek has a great YouTube channel where he shares a lot of his insights on Lacanian psychoanalysis and other psychological concepts. I will include the link below. So check out Derek's channel and like, comment, and subscribe, as they say. So good talking. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, guys. It was awesome.